as I think I mentioned before, we're going super short on the intros and the bios, and we're going to especially do that with this because we have such a short period of time. I want to spend it with our speakers, but just very quickly, my friends, Raj Day, he's a Harvard guy all the through and through. Jacqueline, he's Harvard College and Harvard Law School. Partner at Mayor Brown, and fantastic. Look at his bio, in and out of government, all kinds of great jobs. But I really want to talk about, and you're great, Raj, but let me talk about the ambassador.
Sorry, Raj.
The ambassador, you can imagine, kind of busy man right now. And has returned to the firm. I hope you're going to share a little bit about going in and out of government and so forth and the value of government service. And we'll get to some other things I think are going on in relation to Russia now, I think somewhere. But let me get out of here. Raj is going to do, Mr. Day is going to do the interview, and we'll hear from him and this colloquy with the ambassador. Ambassador, thank you very much.
Thanks, General.
Thanks, Charlie. It's great to be here, at least virtually, with you all. As you can tell, the travel gods looked more fondly on my colleague than they did on me today, so I'm here, which should also tell you that the travel gods recognize hierarchy and let John out of Washington, even though my flight was about 5 minutes apart from his. So I'm glad you get the guest of honor in person. Well, I'm here to introduce and ask Ambassador Sullivan some questions along the lines of the title of our presentation, Public Service, Private Practice, and National Security. And Ambassador Sullivan has a resume that is too long to get into, but I'm going to mention a few things because they provide context for the types of questions I'd like to ask him. He obviously served most recently as ambassador to Moscow for both the Biden and Trump administrations. Before that was Deputy Secretary of State, but he's also served in a variety of other roles in other cabinet departments as the Deputy Secretary and General Counsel at the Commerce Department, as the Deputy General Counsel at the Defense Department. He's played a role at OLC at DOJ, and he's clerked on the Supreme Court, just to name a few of the many roles he's had. So that gives you some sense of the perspective that Ambassador Sullivan, who I will refer to as John because I view him as a friend and more importantly as a mentor in this discussion. So thank you, John, for doing this. And the first question is just, how did you even get attracted to a career in national security in the first place? Big picture.
Sure. Well, thanks, Raj and General Dunlap, and it's great to be here, everyone. I took American Airlines. He took Delta. This isn't a commercial for American. I'm just saying. So I always had an ambition from when I was in college to work in the national security field. I had family members, my father, his brother, and others who had served in the military. And my uncle, my father's brother, after his service in the Navy in World War II, joined the Foreign Service at a 32-year career in the Foreign Service. But I followed the herd. I graduated from college in 1981, and I think half of my graduating class went immediately to law school. And I was not a leader. I was a follower. I went to law school. But it's my interest in the field is what led me to OLC, which is a small office at the Justice Department that is in effect the general counsel of the department and to the Attorney General, addresses a lot of important national security issues, and that's what attracted me to OLC. And there's a progression here that actually gets me to the embassy in Moscow, which is I worked at OLC in the Bush 41 administration, and when Bush 43 was elected, a lot of the people I worked with at the Justice Department had gone to work in the new Bush administration, and that's how I wound up post 9/11 at the Pentagon as the Deputy General Counsel of the Defense Department. They were looking for someone who had served who was a litigator, who had experience at the Justice Department, and I fit that mold. And it was also a tryout for me to see if I could survive scrutiny by then Secretary Rumsfeld, who was had a notorious antipathy for lawyers. He went to law school and dropped out after his first year. Hated law school, hated lawyers, But as Raj mentioned, I worked at the Commerce Department because I passed muster with Secretary Rumsfeld, but my boss at the time, Jim Haynes, the general counsel, the thinking was he was going to leave and become a judge. He didn't get confirmed. I was deputy general counsel. Bush gets reelected. He's staying at DOD. I went to the Commerce Department to be general counsel there and then deputy secretary. How does that get me to Moscow? It's my work at DOD. I met, he was, at the time, I think I first met him, he had just come back from Iraq. He had been, Major General Mattis had been commanding general of 1st Marine Division at the start of Operation Iraqi Freedom. So Mattis knew of me. He gets nominated, or he is selected by President Trump to be Secretary of Defense. And General Mattis called me, asked me if I was interested in working for him at the Pentagon. I said, of course. And to be the general counsel, the job that I never got in the Bush 43 administration. So I'm nominated to be general counsel of the Defense Department. I will fast forward through how that nomination got pulled. I was then nominated to be the Deputy Secretary of State. I did that for 3 years. I was burned out after 3 years as Deputy Secretary of State. Going to Moscow, believe it or not, I viewed as a less stressful job. And, you know, everyone laughs when I say that, but it is true because it was the stress as Deputy Secretary was because of the unpredictability it was in part the chaos of the last administration, just the unpredictability of the job. It was a lot more predictable at Moscow. The Russians were more predictable, not easy to deal with, but just more predictable. And I had more control over my schedule. So that's a recap, Raj, of how I wind up in Moscow, but I ultimately owe it to my service in OSD as the Deputy General Counsel of the Defense Department and the connection that I made with General Mattis, who then became Secretary Mattis.
Well, you've had all these amazing roles in several different departments under, I think, if I'm recalling, 5 different presidents,
right,
and in legal roles and non-legal roles. And in the middle of all of that, you weaved in private practice. So can you give us a sense of, one, do you have a favorite role of all of those? And 2, how did you weave in private practice into that progression?
Well, private practice was thrust on me because I went to work at OLC, young lawyer, went to work at OLC, hired as an attorney advisor, as a civil servant, career lawyer at the Department of Justice, hired by the then Assistant Attorney General, Bill Barr, a young Bill Barr. And for those of you who know him, Judge Ludig, Mike Ludig was the principal deputy. I was hired as a line attorney, a career position, and Barr got promoted to be Deputy Attorney General. Mike Ludig was promoted, nominated, and confirmed to be Assistant Attorney General. And they gave me a promotion. They called me counselor to the Assistant Attorney General. And what I hadn't focused on was, shows you how naive or uninformed I was converted from a career attorney to a political appointee. And the thought never occurred to me, for a variety of reasons, that George H.W. Bush was going to lose in November. You know, at the time that this happened, it was, 1990. The thought that the then president was going to lose in November of 92 and just didn't occur to me. And he did lose to the young governor from Hope, Arkansas. And I found myself out on the pavement. I was a political appointee, and I learned a valuable, difficult Washington lesson. I imagined a career in government as a lawyer at OLC, and there are a number of my friends who actually had multi-decade careers at OLC who had wonderful careers there. I envisioned something like that for myself, and the electorate decided in November of '92 that I should go into the private sector. I went to Mayer Brown. It was Mayer Brown and Platt then, and it was a Chicago-based firm, the way we would describe ourselves. So this is 30 years ago now. And I was one of the, I joined the DC office and I joined the appellate practice because as Raj said, I had clerked on the Supreme Court, I'd worked at OLC. I wanted to be a litigator, but not necessarily a trial lawyer. So I joined the appellate practice, and I was stamped with a scarlet R, which I gladly accepted. I'm a lifelong Republican, but having been a political appointee in the Bush 41 administration, I was out for 8 years. And as I said in my opening remarks, the people I worked with, including a young principal deputy solicitor general named John Roberts, it shows you how time passes. There were a lot of people who were not as subsequently successful as the Chief Justice in his career, but who then went to work in the Bush 43 administration and convinced me to go into the Defense Department. This is post 9/11, and I'd not served in uniform, and I'd actually never been inside the Pentagon until I went for my first interview. I met with Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz at the time, and it was the first time I'd been inside the building. And that was a transformative experience, going from a big Washington law firm with experience at the Justice Department, being immersed in, I thought I was the Deputy General Counsel of the Defense Department. I learned over time that I was nominally the Deputy General Counsel of the Defense Department, but I really worked for something called OSD, the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And there were a lot more important lawyers at the department, including the Senate-confirmed general counsels of the military departments, and then their uniformed counterparts, the TJAGs, the Judge Advocates General, and so it was a really impactful 2 years. And I learned more in those 2 years than in any other time in my life, including law school, serving as deputy secretary. That was really a formative part of my preparation for my subsequent government service.
Well, one thing we're really proud of at Mayer Brown is that you and I, as you recall, founded a national security practice 8 years ago, and you've come back to co-lead that practice in the law. But I think one of the skills that makes you such a good lawyer, John, in addition to a principal, is that you've been both the lawyer and the client in a number of your government roles. So for aspiring national security lawyers, some of the folks in the audience, what advice would you have? So you've been on both sides of the fence. What makes a good lawyer, and particularly a good national security lawyer?
Well, I think my training as a lawyer and my service as a lawyer as deputy GC at Defense, general counsel at the Commerce Department, prepared me as well as anything could to be Deputy Secretary of State. Why? Because I approached my job, and in fact, I've briefed my successors who've become Deputy Secretary after me. I treated the Secretary of State as my client. My first day on the job, I got confirmed. It was a Wednesday in early May of 2017. I was at my office at Mayer Brown. The Senate voted to confirm me. I hit send on my resignation letter to the chairman of the firm. I drove 5 blocks to the State Department, got sworn in less than 30 minutes later as Deputy Secretary of State. And my welcome to the department was one of my colleagues came in with an enormous stack of paper and said, well, sir, at 2 o'clock tomorrow, you will represent the department at a deputies committee meeting at the NSC where you're going to discuss our nuclear posture review. What? Wow. So that was a sleepless night going through an enormous stack of paper. But I learned, it was my focus on my training, legal training, allowed me to take, this is a new problem. I've got to master it. I've got less than 24 hours to do it, but I'm going to become as smart as I can, read everything I can, and represent the Department of State and the Secretary of State at this Deputies Committee meeting. So what are the issues that the department, the Secretary is most concerned about? I'm going to go be, it was then Secretary Tillerson, his advocate at this meeting. And I emphasize this point because at one of the prep meetings for me before I went to the White House, we were sitting around a large conference table in my office, and we were discussing, issues that divided the so-called interagency. And I was basically going to engage with the then Vice Chairman, Air Force General Paul Sullivan, who was the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who's become a good friend of mine. But obviously, General Sullivan was a lot more versed in these issues than I. So we're talking about, the issues where state and defense may be, or in the joint staff may be non-aligned. And somebody at the table said, well, the State Department's view is X, let's say. And so I'm prepared, I'm thinking about what are the arguments for X, how am I going to handle this, et cetera. And then somebody else at the table said, yeah, no, our position is X. Although I heard Secretary Tillerson say his position was Y. And I thought, whoa. The department speaks with one voice. There is one member of the cabinet confirmed by the Senate who speaks for the department. That is the secretary. The department doesn't have a view that is different from the Secretary of State's view. And people started, no, okay, yeah, but it's still X. And I said, well, no. So we had to work through that. But again, who's my client? Is my client the department or is my client the Secretary of State? It's a question that comes up in private practice all the time, right? Who's the client? Is it the general counsel? Is it the board, et cetera? For me, it was the Secretary of State. He's confirmed by the Senate. He speaks for the department. If other people in the department disagree, they have the opportunity to try to convince him he's wrong, but he's the ultimate decider. And then we go to the NSC, participate in our discussion, and ultimately the president decides. But all of that I was prepared for because I've been trained as a lawyer, both in private practice and in government. And it was indispensable to me in surviving those 3 years as deputy secretary.
Well, before we dive into current events, which I'm sure everyone wants to talk about, maybe give us a little comparison of the 2 or 3 tumultuous years you spent as DepSec, which were in Washington tumultuous years, versus the time you spent in Moscow, which probably is the most consequential time in recent memory in that position. So you went from one to the other. How do they, obviously different jobs, but how do they compare for you?
So the best job I've ever had was Deputy Secretary of State by far. It was the most impactful and with global scope, including a lot of issues involving the Russian Federation, which was good preparation to go to Moscow. But having been, as I say, approaching my job as a lawyer with my client, and those of you who may be aware of Secretary Mattis's background won't be surprised by this. When a quick digression, I met Secretary Tillerson, helping him prepare for his confirmation hearing. He called Mattis and said, I understand Sullivan, you've recruited Sullivan, and I think I was, Heather Wilson and I, who was the Air Force Secretary, she and I were the first 2 nominees that Mattis was able to get cleared through the White House. So it was a difficult time for him. He had a pretty fraught relationship with the White House and presidential personnel. But his friend Rex Tillerson called, and Secretary Mattis, being a team player, said, of course, if there's a better use for Sullivan, you can have him. But he had his hook in me. And what that meant was he's famous for making lists. He had a list of all the things that the State Department was doing wrong and interfering with his mission as the Secretary of Defense, protecting our nation. And one of the deal he struck with Tillerson was that he could call me directly to say, John, you know that opinion that the legal advisor's office issued on pick your favorite law of armed conflict topic that we can debate the merits of, but there was no debating with Secretary Mattis, who would say that's a real problem for me in pick your geographic hotspot. So I really had, in some sense, two bosses. I had Secretary Tillerson, but I also had Secretary Mattis, who had a long list of, if Santa makes a list of those who've been naughty and nice, from Secretary Mattis's perspective, he loves American diplomats, is a big proponent of American diplomacy, but there were a number of areas where he thought, particularly legal areas, which is why I was important to him, where he thought that there were constraints that the State Department was imposing that were hindering him in his mission. So it was a careful, I had to walk, I'd always brief Secretary Tillerson on what we were doing, and it was a brief period of, there was real harmony between the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense for the brief time that each of them was in office. And Tillerson and Mattis really saw eye to eye. So it made it easy for me, but I had a two-headed client. And one of the consequences of having been nominated to be the GC of the Defense Department, I'll get to your question, Raj, about going from lawyer to be client. I was, as deputy secretary, I was a client. I had a large law firm at the department, a legal advisor's office, several hundred extremely talented lawyers, many of whom have served for decades in their positions. But I'd been nominated to be the GC of the Defense Department, so people thought, and I had an experience at OLC, et cetera, private practice, that I knew something about the law, and we didn't have a confirmed legal advisor. For my 3 years as deputy secretary, almost 2/3 of it, we didn't have a confirmed legal advisor. We had a terrific one for a brief period of time, Jen Newstead. Jen was legal advisor. She went from the frying pan into the fire. She left as legal advisor when she was offered the job to become general counsel of Facebook. So she's now the general counsel of Meta. But for most of my time, people looked to me to be the final answer before going to the secretary on legal issues. So I both because of Secretary Mattis's interest and the fact that we didn't have a confirmed legal advisor, I still, had one foot still in a law practice, so to speak. When I went to Moscow, that all changed. I was no longer, well, first of all, there is no rule of law in Moscow, and I have a lot of exposure to the criminal justice system in the Russian Federation because of the amount of time I spent working on the cases of Americans who've been wrongfully detained there, and all these cases have gotten a lot of publicity. Happy to talk about any of them or my experiences in the Russian judicial system if there's interest. But so I was able to bring legal skills to bear to say, ooh, this secret proceeding that there's been secret evidence. This is the case of, I guess it would be captioned Russian Federation versus Paul Whelan for espionage. Secret trial, Paul wasn't allowed in to see much of the evidence that was presented against him. I said, that's a problem. And I would give a press conference outside the courthouse, mostly Western media, some Russian media, and say, a secret trial is a problem. It's inconsistent with treaty and other obligations that the Russian Federation has entered into to provide some semblance of what we would call due process, not allowing having secret evidence that the accused doesn't get access to be used to convict him of a crime that results in a 16-year sentence in a Russian labor camp. That's not justice. So my legal skills did come into play there, but it wasn't nearly the way the amount of time I spent on those types of issues as ambassador was much less. If I could, there's one thing, I know we're limited on time and I want to get to questions. One thing that might be of interest, I thought I'd give you this was an area where I was able to call on my legal skills as ambassador, and I'm sure it would be of interest to many in this room, particularly those who are interested in arms control and New START. So when President Biden, I was involved in the strategic security talks that we had with the Russians in the Trump administration. In fact, I led the U.S. delegation as deputy secretary, so I was familiar with the legal issues on extending New START. The treaty adopted in 2010, after ratification by the Senate, had a 10-year period with a provision approved by the Senate that allowed a one-time extension for up to 5 years. There was a debate within the administration, do we extend, for how long, et cetera. Biden gets elected, Biden decides, I believe on day one, if not day one, day two, he's going to extend for 5 years, full-time period. It's exactly what the Russians and President Putin wanted. And we've been talking about this for years. So this is, as the Chinese would say, win-win, right? I mean, the Russians want it, we want it. Here's an accomplishment by President Biden in his first 2 days. So I call the foreign ministry, Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov, and Sergey, my friend, says, great, that's fantastic, everybody's pleased. We understand, John, that your Senate doesn't need to ratify this extension because the treaty that was ratified had a provision in it that the Senate approved for a one-time extension of 5 years at the president's on the president's decision. That's great. But in the Russian Federation, we do need to get the extension approved by our Duma and our Federation Council, basically our House of Representatives and our Senate. I said, well, I assume that the treaty expires in 10 days. I assume you're going to do that in the next 10 days. Oh, you've got to respect our process, Mr. Ambassador. I mean, can you imagine your Senate reviewing a treaty like this in just 10 days? I said, well, Sergey, the treaty lapses in 10 days. Well, we'll extend it provisionally. I said, that's not going to work for us, Sergey, because when that treaty lapses, if we want to extend it after the treaty is no longer in effect, I believe there's a strong legal argument that our Senate, even if the president's agreed, our Senate is going to have to review it again, and that's going to be a real challenge. Oh, John, no, we've got to do it. Sorry. So with back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Finally, the argument that persuaded him and ultimately the Russian government was, I said, this is going to leave this treaty is, if this treaty is important to you and you say it is, it's going to leave a legal cloud over the treaty in the United States. If we agree to something called a provisional extension, there are going to be people who say it is not effective, and if you want to treat it as a treaty, it's got to be reviewed by the Senate. I'm speculating now, but I believed what happened was that the foreign minister Lavrov or someone went to President Putin and said, okay, Biden said we'll extend the treaty for 5 years, and we'll go through the machinery in the Duma and the Federation Council, and we'll do a provisional extension, blah, blah, blah. And they hadn't checked with us They were persuaded by my legal argument now that it was a problem, and they were terrified of going back to President Putin to say, you've got to pick up the phone or authorize us to pick up the phone to call Duma leadership and the leaders of the Federation Council to say, hey, you got to kick it into gear and get this treaty reviewed in the next 3 days. Imagine making that call to, Senator Schumer and McConnell, right? It doesn't work that way in Russia. President Putin can call the Duma leadership and say, get it done now. I made that argument to them, my Russian interlocutors. They didn't appreciate it. I was insulting their system. Disrespect. Come on. I made the same point. I wanted to talk about the Whelan case, and they wouldn't talk to me about Paul Whelan until he'd been convicted, and it was going to take a long time with their process. And as Paul himself called it, he held up a sign at one point, kangaroo court, and I'm sure he got punished for that in the pretrial detention facility he was in. But I said to my Russian interlocutor, I said, look, if you want to, you can call the judge and have him convicted in 2 hours, and then we can talk. So what you're telling me is you just don't want to talk about Whelan. Oh, you're not respecting our judicial system. They don't care about Paul Whelan. They did care about New Start. So treaty expires on, say, Tuesday. Friday, they're still wringing their hands. Oh, I don't know. Monday morning, lo and behold, the Duma has a snap hearing at like 10 a.m. The treaty's approved. The Federation Council at 1 p.m. and it's authorized and everything's done. And so, as I predicted, President Putin could just make it so. But what it indicated to me was that within their system, somebody hadn't told the boss that he had to do that, because otherwise it made no sense. I'm sorry, I've taken up all of our time, but can I just, one more quick point on New Start. Sorry, on New Start. So what, New Start, what Putin said on Tuesday, there's more and less than meets the eye, right? Because they're already not, we haven't had inspections for years. The Bilateral Consultative Commission under the treaty hasn't met for years, starting because of the pandemic. So and then when we were ready for inspections, requested them, they said, yet we're not doing it, you're hostile to us, you're trying to defeat us in Ukraine. This is the foreign ministry. So they had already suspended their participation in the treaty. This was nothing new. And the United States government had already said that. So what Putin said in suspending participation in the treaty was nothing new. But there's more to it than that, because this is the president of the Russian Federation. And if you look at what he said about the treaty, he's now talking about, in considering whether they will come back into compliance, they've got to consider the French and the UK nuclear weapons, which, of course, this is a bilateral treaty. It's actually a multilateral treaty because it's complicated. Lawyers, God, these lawyers, they create problems. But the UK and France aren't parties to the treaty, nor is China. We'd had discussions about broadening the scope of our arms control discussions. But Putin's now saying, he said something to the effect, Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, said, issued a statement saying how regrettable it was. He hopes the Russians will reconsider. Putin says, well, I'm glad to see that NATO now wants to join the New Start. It makes no sense, but he's making it complicated for the Russians to come back into compliance, because in my opinion, they never will. What he's done, what this is and on social media after the speech, these are pro-Kremlin Russian commentators said, this is a more sophisticated and elegant way for us to rattle our nuclear saber. That's the way to do it, because it makes everybody think, well, geez, if we're looking to defeat Russia in Ukraine, look what Putin can do with the last remaining arms control treaty between the United States and Russia. I'm sorry I've gone over.
No, that's a great example of bringing together your legal skills, diplomatic skills, leadership skills. So, John, I think that's the perfect way to end our colloquy. But I'm hoping Charlie will allow the audience to ask one or two questions I can't see them, so I may depend upon you or Charlie to moderate, if it's okay.
Oh, absolutely. I don't have the moral courage to say, Mr. Ambassador, we're not going to ask you any questions about current, because I got to face these people at a cocktail party. I mean, tell us, we were talking a little bit before, everybody's asking what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Let me be everybody.
Yeah. What's going to happen?
Yeah.
I get every day, I was joking with you earlier, every day around the clock I speak about Russia, Ukraine. What I can add is my perspective. I talked about Putin's reference to New START in his speech to the Federal Assembly on Tuesday, which was at the very end of his speech. It was an hour and 40 minutes long. Putin himself later apologized. Well, he never apologizes. He said, if I had been in the audience, I probably would have nodded off, because some of the people in the audience after an hour and 40 minutes were kind of nodding off. So he speaks for an hour. The stuff on New START is at the very, very end. The rest of the speech, the way I read it, is this was a declaration of total war. We, the United States, and our vassals. The last time I heard before I went to Moscow, somebody used the word vassal in a sentence was Jethro in the Beverly Hillbillies, when he thought he was like in King Arthur's court and he wanted Uncle Jed to get him some vassals. But it would be news, by the way. Charles de Gaulle would be turning over in his grave to learn that he was a vassal of the United States, right? But they believe it. Putin believes this stuff. They really do. And the Secretary of the Security Council, Mr. Patrushev, they are true believers. So when people ask me, is Putin rational? Absolutely. But you have to view the world and Ruski Mir, the Russian world, through his eyes. And what he's done, it may seem irrational to us and our vassals in the collective West, which includes the East because it's South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, etc. It's not irrational from his viewpoint.
Could I ask you just one more question?
Sure.
I'll let you go. This is just too good, too great an opportunity. What about the rapprochement, or whatever you want to call it, between China and Russia?
Yeah.
Do you think Putin's going to be successful?
He better be.
You think it's make it or break it?
He is the dependent party now, and there's debate with in Washington and among people in the think tanks about. So Wang Yi, who's the principal foreign policy, the Secretary of State's equivalent in the State Council in the PRC, by the way, whom I met Sergei Lavrov introduced me to Wang Yi. I was at the G20 Foreign Ministerial in November of 2019. I'll give you an idea of what Wang Yi, well, at least what he thinks about me. So I'm talking to Lavrov because I'm deputy secretary, and Lavrov is there, and we're having a conversation. There's a break, and I'm talking to Lavrov, and Wang Yi walks up and he says, come on over, and he introduces me to Wang Yi, who didn't recognize me, but then he heard my name and he knew my name, and he took a step back, he looked at me, and he said, and I quote, Sullivan, and he points at me, and he turns and walks away. Like, good to meet you, too. Lavrov, by the way, the Russians were, because I was deputy secretary, they thought that this was a sign by the United States government that they were sending the number 2 person at the State Department to be the U.S. ambassador. And this was a statement not just by the U.S. government or the Trump administration, by the United States, of the importance of the U.S.-Russia relationship. What they didn't realize was it was really a reflection of the fact that I was exhausted and had to get the heck out of the chaos that was inside the Beltway. So Wang Yi goes to the Munich Security Conference, and he is saying things that is not popular, not only in Washington, but across Eastern Europe and in Paris and Berlin. The biggest trading partner for the PRC is the EU. And the economic consequences, if they continue, and I've seen their peace proposal that was announced today, which I think President Zelensky is being polite and saying that the Ukrainian government is going to study it. For those of you who are familiar with how the PRC phrases things, they talk about democracy with Chinese characteristics, right? That this is a communist state led by the Communist Party in the vanguard, but we're really a democracy. This is a peace plan. This is a peace plan with Chinese characteristics. Both sides are at fault. Sovereignty needs to be respected. Somebody said, it wasn't a U.S. government official, it was Jake Sullivan said, no relation. Jake said, you don't need to get past the first line of the 12-point Chinese peace plan because it says something to the effect as translated, sovereignty and national borders need to be respected. Okay. 141 countries just voted in the General Assembly. The Russians need to get out. So, a long-winded answer to your question, which is Putin is very dependent on the support of basically the BRICS. And interesting footnote, by the way, on the General Assembly vote, Brazil voted for with the 141. The Indians and Indian government and the PRC abstained. The Russians did gain, so there were 141 votes in the very first General Assembly resolution was adopted a year ago, but there were 5 votes against. There were 7 votes against this time. I think Mali and Eritrea joined Syria, North Korea, Belarus, Russia, and I'm missing one. But 31 countries abstained. India and China abstained. Brazil did not. If his ally, not ally, if his partner, unlimited partnership, which also is not true. By the way, the peace plan says no nukes. One of the 12 points from the PRC peace plan says no nukes. So there is a limit to the unlimited partnership. You, Vladimir Putin, as much as you like to rattle your nuclear saber, can't use nukes in Ukraine. Putin is much more, he is the dependent party in that. And, Xi may well go to Moscow this spring, which I guess is the plan. Zelensky said today that he expects to meet with Xi. I don't think you're going to see Xi going to Kyiv, but Zelensky said, it was a declarative statement, I will meet with Xi. I don't know if Xi has agreed to that. But whether it's providing, and I know one of the professors who presented earlier today talking about the PRC providing lethal assistance and all of that, fair points about the ineffectiveness of sanctions, particularly against an economy the size of the PRC's. But Russia is dependent on the PRC, to a lesser extent India. The Indians are buying a lot of Russian energy, oil and gas, cheaply. But Putin really depends on Xi. And which is ultimately a bad thing for him, because Russians don't like that, because they know when they sit across the table from one another, Xi and Putin, or a Russian leader on the other side and Xi, they look at Xi and they see their patron. Xi looks across the table and he sees a peasant who's got a lot of oil and gas and a lot of nukes, but we're going to catch up to you on that. And that is anathema to Putin's worldview.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much. Raj, I apologize for taking more of your time.
No,
and the investor's time.
Took up your coffee break. Sorry about that.
No, this was fantastic. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. And really, you've been so generous with this. And now we're going to take 10 minutes, and we'll be back at 3:15. And